What happens when a civilian without ranks starts blocking army routes? He was ridiculed, dismissed, and attempts were made to erase him. But a week later, the cones were standing where the generals had stood before. It started with cones, bright, hand-painted, awkward little cones, set in the middle of a war zone. And it started with a man the army didn't want. His name was George Ellery, 39 years old, too old to be drafted in 42, but too stubborn to sit out history. He had degrees in civil engineering, a decade of bridge work across Ohio, and a mind that couldn't stop seeing patterns, even in chaos. Roads were his language, and World War II was speaking in detours, dead ends and disasters waiting to happen. On October 14th, 1944, George wasn't supposed to be anywhere near the front. He'd been attached to the logistics wing of the 99th Infantry Division as a civilian engineering liaison. That's Army speak for, he's here, but don't let him touch anything important. His role was to assist with supply road assessments. Instead, George was out on a dirt road near Malmedy, Belgium, with mud up to his shins and a dozen handmade cones in the back of his Jeep, trying to keep the third convoy from driving straight into a German kill zone. And that's exactly when Major Carl Harper spotted him. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Harper barked, trench coat flapping in the cold October wind. George didn't even turn around. "Redirecting traffic," he muttered, setting another cone in the middle of the cracked road. "This isn't a construction site, Ellery. It's the Ardennes." George finally looked up. "Sir, that road you're sending them down, it bottlenecks by a collapsed bridge. No cover, one Luftwaffe spotter, and it's a turkey shoot." Harper didn't flinch, didn't care. "You're a civilian. You don't give orders. You don't place cones. You observe." George exhaled slowly and looked past Harper, toward the horizon, where black smoke from the morning's ambush still hung over the trees like a warning sign no one was reading. The thing about war is, it doesn't always want to be fixed. It wants to be fought. That night, back at the forward logistics station, George was told to take a few days off. In reality, he was being pulled, reassigned to depot duty. File sorting. Translation: you made someone look bad. He packed his maps into a crate, stuffed the last few cones under a tarp in his Jeep, and kept his mouth shut. But the next morning, he was up before the sun, repainting cone tips with makeshift reflectors, using foil from medical rations. "You're not letting this go, are you?" said Captain Johnny Trumbull, an artillery officer George sometimes ate with. "That road took out 7 trucks yesterday," George replied. "And they'll send 5 more today, unless someone stands there and says, 'No.'" Trumbull sighed. "You're going to get yourself court-martialed by being right." By day 3, the cones were showing up in reports. Unidentified obstacle markings on Route 2A. Possible partisan interference with logistics pathing. Nobody could imagine the truth. A single stubborn engineer with a brush, a bucket of paint, and the nerve to defy chain of command. Not with a gun, but with plastic markers. And the strange thing, some drivers started obeying them, because they made sense. The cones pointed away from flooded paths. They marked washed-out shoulders. They warned of rubble or dead-end routes that hadn't yet been cleared. George wasn't trying to be a hero. He just couldn't not fix things. And for that, he became a problem. On the 5th day, Colonel Richard Everett, commander of the division's rear echelon, had him summoned. Everett had a face like a brick wall, square, silent, and ready to flatten you, "You're placing unauthorized roadblocks on military supply routes," Everett said, slapping a photo onto the table. A grainy shot of a jeep swerving around one of George's cones. Behind it, burned-out wreckage. "That truck ignored the cone," George said, pointing, "and now it's part of the road. Don't get smart." "I'm not. I'm tired, and I'm watching the same mistake kill people every day, while I'm told to inventory paperclips." "Silence, then. You have no authority to alter Army directives, period." George leaned forward. "Sir, respectfully, authority doesn't outrank accuracy." Everett's jaw clenched. George was dismissed. That night, George didn't go to his assigned quarters. He went back to the intersection where the third convoy had almost died and quietly replaced the cones that had been removed. He added new ones, laid out sandbags around one, just enough to suggest official presence. When a young lieutenant drove up in a supply truck and saw the markings, he rolled down the window. "Hey, this road's still closed." George didn't lie. "Still dangerous. You can go, but the bridge up ahead isn't rated for your axle weight." The lieutenant hesitated. "What's the alternate?" George pointed to the left fork, which looped through a farm road. 2 miles longer, still gravel, but stable. The truck turned left. George didn't smile. He just set the next cone down. The next morning, someone slashed his tires. 2 cones were found crushed in a ditch. His map case was missing. No investigation was opened. Instead, George received a typed reprimand. "Cease and desist all unauthorized traffic directives." It was signed, dated, and hand-delivered. He folded it once, stuck it in his breast pocket, and went out to repaint his cones. This is how it begins. Not with orders, but with resistance. Not with a uniform, but a question. What if the people in charge aren't paying attention? George Ellery wasn't a hero, but he was right, and sometimes, in war, that's the most dangerous thing you can be. We're only at the beginning, and trust me, it gets much harder from here. Stick around to find out what happens when the system pushes back even harder. Rain didn't stop. Not for orders, not for reputations, and definitely not for George Ellery, who was now officially persona non grata. The engineering corps had been advised to stop communicating with him. His field access badge was downgraded, his jeep reassigned, the cones labeled interference equipment, and confiscated. That was the Army's answer to a man who tried to prevent trucks from driving into artillery kill zones, take his cones, and send him to a ditch. Literally. "Congratulations," said the logistics clerk with a smirk. "You've been transferred to Ground Engineering Ops Alpha. That's the group fixing drainage on the Malmedy bypass." "You mean the swamp road?" George asked. "Bingo. You are on mud patrol now, shovels in the back." By that afternoon, George was waist-deep in a soaked roadside trench with 2 privates who had no idea why a 39-year-old civilian engineer was digging beside them like a man possessed. "You piss someone off?" one of them asked. "Not someone," George muttered, pushing another mound of silt out of the flood channel. "Everyone." The drainage crew wasn't glamorous. Their job was to keep roads passable for convoys, literally shovel mud and clear blockages before military transport slipped or sank. The cold October rains made it a daily fight. George didn't complain, because he saw what no one else did. The Army's designated safe route was starting to collapse. And he knew why. Day 2 on ditch duty, George took a map from his coat and started sketching elevation drops between the farm road and the timber bridge on the standard route. He wasn't supposed to be doing that. But when the 14th Supply Group lost 2 gasoline tankers to a mudslide that night, no one asked how he knew it would happen. They just yelled about fuel loss and told his crew to dig faster. "Shut up and dig, Ellery," barked the new site officer, a Lieutenant Voss, barely 26, and glowing with misplaced confidence. "We don't need maps. We need trenches." George looked up, soaked to the bone. "You're going to lose the road." "Not if you do your job. This is my job. No, your job is to obey. Let the real engineers handle the strategy." That night, George found himself in the back of a field tent, coat steaming, eyes fixed on the edges of a terrain model he'd carved into a packing crate using chalk and string. He marked 4 routes. The one he'd originally flagged with cones, the current supply route, and 2 secondary roads. He labeled them not by numbers, but by consequences. Saves lives, loses trucks, kills convoys, no one comes back. The next morning the weather broke, briefly, and with the clearing sky came the brass, high-level visits from rear echelon command. General Kessler, known for his hard jaw and harder reputation, toured the bypass. George wasn't supposed to be there. He was supposed to be in the next trench over. But when he saw the general reviewing new roadmaps, ones that still included the same dangerous route, he couldn't help himself. He stepped forward. "General, may I speak?" Silence. Voss blanched. Kessler turned, eyes narrowing. "Who are you?" "Civil engineer, logistics division. I flagged this route as compromised a week ago." Kessler didn't speak, just stared. "Sir, if you continue to route heavy transports over that timber bridge, are you the one who placed those cones?" George didn't flinch. "Yes, sir. I've read the report." And just like that, Kessler walked away. Later that night, George's cot was missing from the tent. His name erased from the roster, his supply pass voided. He'd been erased, except by the people in the ditches. Private Lewis, a 20-year-old from Pittsburgh with a busted shoulder, approached George by the mess line. "Hey, that farm road you kept pushing. My cousin's unit got diverted through it. Made it through yesterday. You saved 'em." George didn't respond. He just nodded and stepped back into the shadows. But the system hadn't finished with him. 2 days later, George was summoned again. This time not by an officer, but by a military police unit. "You've been seen interfering with traffic flow," they said. "Accusations of insubordination. Unauthorized influence on command structure." George was silent. Then they opened a folder. Inside, photos of his cones, testimonies from officers, a quote from Colonel Everett. "Dangerous idealist, disruptive, thinks he knows better than command." "You could be removed from field operations entirely," the officer said. "You want that?" George leaned forward. "You're all looking at the cones. I want you to look at the burn marks behind them." But they didn't. They assigned him to quartermaster sorting, the Army's version of a broom closet for inconvenient minds. And yet, the next morning cones reappeared, not placed by George, but by someone else. He didn't know who, but they used his pattern, his placements, even the foil reflectors. The road had learned to speak. "We're on the edge of the storm now. What happens next will shake everything, and no one will walk away unchanged." Don't miss what comes in Chapter 3 if you also think that sometimes a simple action can change the course of an entire war. Support this story. Like it, subscribe to the channel, and write in the comments. Would you believe a person who just puts out cones? For 6 days, George Ellery had been a shadow, stripped of title, silenced by command, boxed into a storeroom full of moldy boots and mislabeled rations. And yet, somehow, his ideas were moving without him. Cones were reappearing on roads he hadn't touched. Makeshift detour signs, scribbled in chalk on barn walls, were showing up exactly where he once placed them. He wasn't leading anymore. He'd become something worse. He was being quietly obeyed. On the morning of October 21st, George sat at the back of a quartermaster tent, counting canteens when Private Jennings walked in. 17, wide-eyed, too green to know better. Sir, not sir, Mr. Ellery. They're pulling the 92nd through Sector B, full armor. George froze. Sector B? Yes, sir. The southern slope. You know, by the... George stood up so fast his chair clattered. That road's mined, and it's sloped at a 5-degree angle with loose gravel. That's a coffin run. They said it's cleared. It's not. George bolted. No orders, no clearance, no jeep. Just a soaked field map, his boots and 40 minutes before the first column rolled out. He ran, through rain-soaked fields, across half-collapsed fences, past rows of confused supply clerks shouting, "Where are you going?" He didn't answer, because if he did, he might slow down, and he had no time left. He reached the ridge just as the first tank turned onto the slope. Panther Hill. That's what the Germans called it. Long range, open top, perfect for a Pak-40 ambush. George had seen the German schematics weeks ago, stuffed in a captured binder no one cared to read. He waved both arms, standing in the middle of the road like a lunatic. Stop. Turn back. The lead tank commander popped the hatch. You out of your mind. We're on directive. You're on a kill path. There are charges under that gravel. I've seen the wiring plan. I've seen it. Behind them, the next tank revved impatiently. Then the next. A full column stretching a mile long. Armor and fuel trucks and infantry, all backing the official plan. Step aside, the commander barked. George didn't move, so they radioed it in. 10 minutes later, Colonel Everett arrived, red-faced, trench coat billowing, boots kicking up mud. Ellery, I warned you. They're walking into a trap. You are interfering with operational command. Then relieve me after you save them. That's not how this works. Then how does it work, Colonel? Do we bury them first and then reroute? Silence, and behind them, the thunder of a distant blast. Not on the hill, but just beyond it. A flash, then smoke, then screams. The rear column, the one that had taken the adjacent, safe route, had hit a charge. A munitions truck had gone up. 2 men were already on fire, diving into ditches. Radios lit up with panic. Everett froze. George didn't. He turned to the tank commander. New route, northeast farm road. Take the bend slow. The bridge holds. I tested it. Stay off the shoulder. The commander didn't wait for Everett's nod. The tanks turned, and the rest followed. That night no reprimand came. No MP at his tent. No forms to sign. Just silence. And an empty chair waiting at the officer's tent, where Everett quietly drank his coffee alone. The next morning, George returned to his storage shed. His map was gone. In its place, a fresh set of updated logistics sheets, with a new route stamped into them. His route. No one said his name, but the cones were back. Official this time, painted with Army regulation stripes. He walked past them like a ghost. But the cost had been paid. 6 dead, 11 wounded. Men that could have lived if the system had listened sooner. George didn't celebrate. He didn't sleep. He spent the night sitting alone, drawing new lines. Not because anyone asked. but because he couldn't stop seeing the gaps others ignored. 3 days later, he was called to a new assignment. Different unit, different town. The officer didn't explain, just handed him a sealed envelope. Orders from higher up. Looks like someone finally wants to see your maps. George opened the flap, scanning the destination. He didn't say anything, just nodded once and walked away. This was the moment everything changed. But if you think that was the end of the fight, think again. Chapter 4 will take you deeper into what happens when your ideas become bigger than your name. George didn't speak during the transport. The jeep bounced along muddy roads as artillery rumbled in the east. The driver, a corporal with more scars than stripes, didn't ask questions. He just handed George a ration bar and kept his eyes on the road. It took 4 hours to reach Stavelot. The town was little more than shattered windows and rumor, whispers of a German push, whispers of collapse. The front line was moving fast, and the city had turned into a ghost between maps. Nobody knew who owned it. Nobody wanted to admit they didn't. Which is why, once again, they turned to the wrong man. George was brought to a field table under canvas, where Major Arlen Chase pointed to an aerial photo marked with too many red circles. "We've lost 3 convoys trying to hold this city," Chase said, lighting a cigarette with shaking hands. "Our men don't know the terrain. The Germans do." George looked at the photos. Bridges, marked. Bottlenecks, ignored. Escape routes, non-existent. It was worse than bad. It was suicidal. "Why am I here?" George asked flatly. "Because someone up the chain heard you made roadblocks out of cones and got a tank division to live long enough to talk about it." George didn't smile. "You want a miracle." "No," Chase said. "I want a way to hold this city without leaving a grave under every man's boot." George worked through the night. No fanfare, no orders. He moved through Stavelot's ruined streets with a pencil, a flashlight, and a gut full of fear. He found 7 points where armor would get stuck, 4 blind corners with sniper angles, and 2 roads so narrow a single firebomb could clog the entire retreat. By dawn, he'd marked every alternate path with chalk and colored tape scavenged from ration packs. Not cones, not this time. Now it was tactical routing. Official, but only if they let it be. When the first units rolled in, George stood on a balcony overlooking the main square, watching trucks try to navigate a route that had never been designed for armor. They scraped buildings. Treads cracked cobblestone, and still they pushed forward until they didn't. At 11:43 a.m., the Germans hit back. A mortar team on the eastern ridge shelled the rear column. 2 half-tracks exploded. A medical jeep was flipped like a toy. George sprinted down from the building, grabbing the radio from a fallen operator. "Redirect. Junction 12 through the bakery alley. Single file." "Who is this?" came the voice on the other end. "The guy who doesn't want to write your casualty report." Somewhere in that chaos, the men listened. They turned down a street George had cleared at 4 a.m., one the maps called non-military usable. But it held. Every axle, every boot. They escaped the kill zone, and then the whispers started. That night, around a fire pit dug in the middle of a bombed-out courtyard, a junior officer asked him, "You some kind of map whisperer?" George didn't look up. "No, I just see the cracks where people stop looking." But not everyone was ready to listen. Captain Levins, head of route security, confronted him the next day. "I don't like how fast you're moving." "I'm not moving fast. The war is. We have procedures, and the procedures have body counts. Levin's face hardened. "Stay in your lane, Ellery." George stared back. "I'm building the lanes." That same evening, George found 3 of his markings scrubbed clean, washed off the walls of an old church. A truck had already followed the wrong route and been hit. 3 more wounded, 1 dead. The name wasn't on the report, but George remembered his face. A kid with a chipped tooth who'd offered him coffee that morning. "He's not coming back," said one of the medics. "Took it straight through the chassis." George said nothing, but his hand, gripping the railing, shook until his knuckles went white. Later, he sat alone in a bombed-out cafe, spreading out his map and quietly remarked the routes. Then he carved 3 words into the edge of the table. "Do not erase." The next morning, cones were back, but now they were being placed by engineers in uniform, with flags, with radios, with trucks behind them. George didn't lead the crew, but every placement matched his map. Exactly. At 4:15 p.m. an order came down. "Maintain position at all costs. Stavelot must not fall." George watched the men around him dig in, reinforce barricades, string wire, and all the while the city pulsed with tension, because they weren't just holding ground. They were finally listening to a man the army never trusted. That night, George walked through the streets, not as a ghost, but as a man whose silence was finally louder than the brass. He didn't wear rank, didn't carry a rifle, but soldiers stepped aside to let him pass. One of them nodded. "You're the cone guy, right?" George looked at him. "No," he said quietly. "I'm the reason you made it here. If you think this is where the story calms down, think again. Chapter 5 brings the reckoning, when the system has to face the man it tried to erase. There are 2 kinds of orders in war, the ones written on paper, and the ones carved in memory, by what you've seen, what you've lost, what you refuse to let happen again. George Ellery had no paper, but the city was still standing, and that fact alone made certain men very, very uncomfortable. 2 days after the ambush outside Stavelot, the 7th Transport Corps was ordered to reroute all movement through the corridors George had mapped. No ceremony. No thank you. Just a memo with updated instructions, passed from desk to desk, missing one name. His. Inside a muddy tent on the city's edge, George sat with a battered radio, pencil behind his ear, boots soaked to the bone. He didn't care, because the routes were holding, supply was flowing, casualties were down. But then came the truck, unmarked, quiet. Out stepped Colonel Whitner, Field Operations Supervisor from Corps Command. A man built like marble, handsome, cold, perfect hair, even under shelling. "You're Ellery." "You read my file?" George asked. "I read your footprints. You've been walking through protocol like it wasn't even there." George folded his arms. "Because protocol didn't know where the mines were." Whitner didn't smile. He sat across from George and laid out a clean folder. "You've made yourself useful." George said nothing. "But you've also made enemies. Some high up." Still nothing. "There's a proposal on the table. Transfer to Central Engineering Command. Limited authority. Full clearance. You'll report to us directly." "Under whose name? Does it matter?" George looked down at his hands, still stained from chalk and dirt. "If I say no..." Whitner leaned in. "Then we rotate you out. Back to logistics. Back to silence." That night, George walked alone through the warehouse district, now a makeshift depot. He passed trucks following his turns, men walking his grids, but no one knew his face. Not really. The system had accepted the plan, but not the man. The next morning, George stood outside the town church, where soldiers were sandbagging the front steps. A chaplain walked out holding a coffee. "You're the one who drew the new map?" he asked. George nodded. The chaplain looked down the street. "I buried 12 boys last week. This week, just 2. He handed George the cup. "You're not loud, but you're winning." George didn't drink. He just held the cup and stared at the sunrise. "Not winning, just not letting them die in straight lines. But even silence has a limit. At 1400 hours, an airborne division dropped into the eastern ridge, and the command immediately tried to revert to the old route grid. Panic, bottlenecks, bad radios, confusion. George ran straight into Field HQ. "You can't route armor that way. You'll trap the airborne in Sector 3. A captain stepped forward. "Sir, this is not your division. You don't give input here." "Input? I'm giving you the only map that doesn't end in body bags." "You're out of line." George threw the clipboard on the table. "So is your convoy." Silence. Then a young lieutenant spoke. "He's right." That moment cracked something. In the room, in the chain of command, in the myth that the system was always smarter than the man on the ground. The next day, Colonel Whitner returned, but this time with General Kessler and a photographer. George didn't smile. He didn't pose. He just stood by the chalkboard, pointing to a red line that now fed 3 cities. "What's this one called?" the general asked. George looked at him. "Route 5. We need a name for it." George picked up the chalk. He wrote, "The Cones." It was quiet. Then someone in the back laughed, another clapped, a third murmured, "That's the one he built by hand. No rank, no badge, just cones." That night George sat alone in a mess hall. A private approached. "They said you're getting a medal." George didn't look up. "They also said cones were unauthorized." The kid laughed. "You should give it back." "Maybe I will." He never did, but he never wore it either, because he didn't want to be honored for surviving the system. He wanted to be remembered for beating it. With nothing but common sense, stubborn hands, and a few pieces of red plastic no one thought mattered. And if you thought this war was just bullets and flags, remember this. Sometimes the road that saves a city doesn't come from a general. It starts with a man they tried to silence. Chapter 6 will take you to the aftermath, when the war moves on but the truth stays behind. Don't miss it. War moves fast. Recognition moves slow. By the time the medals were polished and the reports edited, George Ellery was already gone. Not dead, just reassigned. Like the weather. No ceremony, no farewell, no speech. The city he helped hold wasn't even sure who to thank. But the cones remained. Weeks passed, then months. The snow came early to Belgium that year. Roads froze, communications froze with them. But every now and then, someone would find a chalk arrow on a brick wall, half faded but still visible, or a rusted metal cone, dented, but still upright in the dirt. And a few of them remembered. George's new assignment was Reims, France, depot work, technical advising, back to paper, back to silence. But the rumors followed him. "Is it true you rerouted a whole division with nothing but cones?" George didn't answer, because truth is a lot messier than that. One afternoon, as he was logging bridge weights into a supply ledger, Captain Johnny Trumbull appeared. The same artillery officer from Malmedy, with more gray in his beard and a limp he didn't have last time they met. "Heard you saved Stavelot." George kept writing. "Heard they gave you a medal." No response. "You keep turning down assignments?" George finally looked up. "I didn't come here to get promoted." "Then why are you still here?" George leaned back. "Because the war hasn't figured out who it needs yet." That night, George walked past a bulletin board where new engineers were gathered, reviewing map updates. One of them, barely 22, tapped a red route with his pencil. "Who plotted this? It's tight, real tight, but smart." Another replied, "I think it was some guy in Belgium. Started with traffic cones." George kept walking, but it wasn't over. Not really. Because just as the maps began to bear his logic, the system found new ways to erase his name from the legend. Reports started listing his routes as tactical adjustments. His field notes were recompiled under joint authorship, and his chalk marks were cleaned, standardized, and filed under sectional routing protocols. Even the cones, once deemed unofficial, were now called Zone Markers Type B in Army manuals. George laughed when he saw that. But it didn't feel good. A month later, a new officer tried to remove him from a planning session. "We have this under control," she said. "There's a process now." George stood there, map in hand. "And what happens when the process fails?" She stared at him. "Then we update the process." "And who pays in the meantime?" He left before she could answer. George didn't need applause. He needed results. And sometimes, even those came late. Like the letter that arrived 6 months after the city was secured, stamped from a field unit in the Ardennes. No return name, just a torn photograph inside. A photo of the main square in Stavelot. A child playing next to a cone. Still standing, still marked with George's signature diagonal chalk slash. On the back, in pencil, "We made it, thanks to your line." He kept that photo, not on his wall, in his boot, right under the heel, so he could feel it every time he stood up. When the war ended, George didn't write a book. He didn't tour, didn't lecture, didn't explain. He went home and got a job inspecting county roads in Ohio. Because if there was one thing he'd learned, it was this. Even peace needs cones. Years later, when a reporter tried to track him down for a hidden hero piece, George declined the interview. Instead, he sent back a note. Handwritten, simple. "The road didn't need my name, just my hands." But in one Army manual, tucked in an annex no one reads, there's a diagram labeled Improvised Forward Route Identification, Civilian Origin. And next to it, a cone, scratched, dented, marked with a chalk slash, because some things the system forgets. But the road remembers. If this story moved you, pass it on. Sometimes the quietest decisions leave the loudest marks. Leave a comment. What would you have done in George's boots? Like, subscribe, and never underestimate the person placing the cones.